So thanks for coming. What's your name?
Marcus.
Marcus. I'm Ryan Staley. I'm one of the staff psychologists over at the Counseling Services. So Eating Disorder Awareness Week, I was approached by our outreach coordinator about a topic that I might be interested in presenting on. And I actually thought initially I was presenting this in April, and I found out not too long ago that I'm actually presenting it now. I was thinking Eating Disorder Week was later, but here we are. So I'm going to run through a few slides here, but as we go through, please feel free if either of you two actually have any questions that come up, let me know and I'll do my best to answer. I don't presume to be the expert on this. I've got some experience in some of my practice working with males that have struggled with body image and eating disorder issues. They come up quite a bit. Some of my background has been in substance abuse, inpatient treatment. It certainly came up a lot there in both women and men, and also in college population, both here at the Counseling Services Center, and I have a private practice outside of here that I meet with a lot of college students who get referred out or just end up starting their experience there. So that's some of the background I'm drawing on, of course, continuing education and just interest in it in general. So again, if you got any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and we'll go from there. So clearly the topic here is body image issues in males, eating disorders typically going with that. Oftentimes it's been considered kind of a disorder or issues that are typically viewed as something women struggle with. And I'm just curious kind of when you saw that this was being presented today, what your kind of interest in the topic was and kind of your own thoughts about kind of eating disorders and body image issues.
This just comes more personal. Well as having
Okay.
That's been a part of my experience.
Right.
Just body dissatisfaction.
Right. Yeah, so personal experiences drove that interest. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's oftentimes the case for people who have an interest in anything. Usually there's oftentimes a personal component to it. And which is the case for me as well. As an adolescent, I moved from Southern California to Kansas, and it was speaking of some of the things that can make us increase the risk of developing eating disorders. Big life stressors can be one of those things. In addition to coming from a culture where it was kind of fun in the sun, fit, tanned bodies and athletic. And I remember as a kid also kind of being overweight and making that shift to kind of accepting that I was always the biggest kid in class in a lot of ways. But as you got older and kids started to pay more attention to that, and there was teasing as a part of that, began to kind of have some struggles myself with some body image issues and disordered eating, and have had to kind of work through some of those things myself. So again, personal stories and interests certainly drew me to this topic as well. And just the need, as I think about the importance of awareness, feeling like I don't know anybody else that has struggled with that at that time. Not realizing, of course, as we are getting more acquainted with the numbers that are on the rise as far as men coming forward and young men too, who are acknowledging struggles with body image issues and eating disorder kinds of problems. So as we think about the awareness that's growing in terms of the struggles with eating disorders and body image issues among men, I was reading, as I was kind of doing some research for this, there was in the popular press, it was dailynews.com, presented an article that talked about researchers reporting over the last 6 years, a 70%, I think was the number they quoted, increase in men seeking treatment in hospitals and clinics for eating disorder issues. And one of the things that they attributed the increase to was more celebrities, more male celebrities becoming more open and candid about some of their own personal struggles with body image issues and eating disorders. And so a couple of them, I went ahead and found a few few celebrities that most of us would be pretty well acquainted with that have acknowledged some struggles with that, those particular issues. So Aaron Carter was one of those. This is a before and after picture, and was in the articles that this was presented in, was basically expressing some really positive feelings about the differences in terms of the after picture being kind of indicative of beginning to work through some of the challenges with body acceptance and struggles with body image and eating disorder issues that have kind of been a part of some of his presenting problems. Familiar face maybe with the Winter Olympics. I don't know how many people watch the Winter Olympics. I haven't done a survey of that, but certainly Adam Rippon is a male figure skater, as you can see, who has been pretty open with media and in interviews about his own personal struggles with body image and eating disorder issues, and some of the things that he's talked about being particularly in the sport like figure skating, that there's such a high pressure to look a certain way and perform at a certain level that it was really that pressure that drove him to be struggling with really restrictive eating and almost to the point of kind of starvation strategies to keep his weight down. Oftentimes the comparison with others who are other figure skaters who are smaller, smaller framed, and just compared to himself looking bigger. And so that comparison is something that comes up sometimes, really oftentimes as an issue that can begin to contribute to struggles with kind of negative views of yourself and body. So when you're in a sport where kind of a small framed, fit, weight becomes kind of a focus of part of what you're doing to be successful in that particular sport, whether it's wrestling or figure skating or jockeys, or professions that require being in front of people, where trim, fit, well-groomed is kind of the way that we express success and demonstrate and show that those demands to kind of present in a certain way, look a certain way, fit a certain mold, certainly can increase the likelihood of those struggles, and he acknowledged those as well. I thought this was interesting. Dennis Quaid in People magazine was pretty open, I thought courageously so, about struggles with anorexia, struggles with weight and body kind of image and physical appearance kinds of things. Eminem as well was talking to Men's Health about a compulsive running habit that he had kind of developed, and it actually got to the point where he was really just, as he put it, kind of becoming addicted to running and what it was doing with his body, and really went, I think in the article talked about how he went from 230 to like 145, and pretty significant weight loss. And so both have been pretty open with struggles with, again, body image and weight concerns and different kinds of strategies that have been really potentially pretty unhealthy to kind of try to meet some of those standards and fit kind of a certain ideal. And a little closer to home, this is actually going to be a video. I'll just show a brief clip of it, about 5 minutes, of a K-State student, a male K-State student, who is describing in this video his own personal struggles with body image and eating, disordered eating, unhealthy eating habits, and is, again, open in this interview. This particular interview is part of a 3-part series. So let's take a look. Oh. And this is posted on University Laugh Cafe. So this young man's name is John Smith.
Hi, I'm John Smith. I'm a senior at K-State, and I want to share with you my struggle with an eating disorder and compulsive exercise. When I was younger, I had chronic migraines and was sick a lot, and when I went to the doctor, they put me on these steroids to kind of help with the headaches, and what happened was, like, as a result of those steroids, I gained a lot of weight, and around fourth grade, there was like a notable increase in my weight and size. And at school, I was teased a lot for not being the most athletic kid. I talked to girls really easily because my sister was my closest sibling. So I was called gay at school and teased regularly there. And when I was at home, my eating habits and change in size kind of took notice, and I was teased for that. Comments were made about what food I ate, the portions I ate, things like that, as compared to my cousins, and I always felt like I wasn't good enough compared to all of my other friends and my other siblings, being the youngest of 6. So in 5th grade, my mom, from what my mom tells me, I came home one day and told her that I wanted to go on a diet, and she told me that boys my age don't go on diets, but that we could kind of change things. I could start eating healthier and be more active. I started doing Taekwondo, and I remember seeing an ad for it in a Dairy Queen. I filled this thing out to get like free lessons, and it was about wanting to be healthier and like more fit and active. I kind of like fell in love with that the first time I went, and after that, that kind of changed how my athleticism was viewed and how I kind of like viewed myself, because I never really thought I was good for anything or athletic enough, or I don't know, I didn't compare. And Taekwondo is where I like really started to thrive. I started eating healthier and started manipulating what I ate and started having good foods and bad foods and constructing these like ideals of what I needed to be. Throughout the course of like the rest of grade school, as my Taekwondo like went on, I was getting more involved with that and was really excelling compared to like my other classmates. 7th grade, going to 7th grade, I went to the Junior Olympics and got 3rd. But that summer when I was training like 3 times a day and going to classes with the adults and the kids because I was at that awkward age. I was just really noticing how much of an effect exercise had on me. So from a young age, I started viewing exercise as like the reward, but also something that I had to do even if I didn't want to. And I started doing better in the school sports I was playing through CYO. I went from being like the slowest kid on the track team in 6th grade to being one of the faster people in 8th grade. I was doing better in all the other sports, so I was feeling better about myself competence-wise, but not necessarily physically. I still thought I was that really pudgy 5th grader that just really wanted to change everything about myself. And 8th grade I started playing football, mostly because I have 4 older brothers, and my dad was all about all of his boys playing football and kind of having like the All-American experience. For weigh-ins in football in 8th grade, I was really close to the cutoff mark for a lineman, which I remember the cutoff was 135 for 8th graders, and I was 132. So I had to go back to the second weigh-ins just after the start of the season to make sure I was still making weight. And after that first weigh-in, since I was close-ish to being a lineman, I was like bound determined not to be. Skipping a lot of meals, lying to my mom about like eating breakfast or eating most of my lunch. During that football season in 8th grade, I started purging a lot. I don't really remember the first time I purged, but I remember being at a scout camp and one of my friends got sick, and one of my other friends made just a random comment about how if you throw up you'll feel better, and like how his brother did that for wrestling and things like that. And I kind of just took that and ran with it. For that year I was just really getting rid of anything I put into my body through purging and through exercise, doing like all the sports I was doing at that time. I had lost weight by the second weigh-in, and I felt this like pride in myself for taking control of that. While I was like excelling athletically, I was
Stop there. Thoughts? I'm wondering if there was anything in particular that stuck out for you, or that seems salient as he was sharing about his kind of experience, because a lot of what he's sharing is pretty consistent with a lot of things we'll be talking about here shortly. Wonder what things maybe got your attention. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I was struck by his comment that relates to the issue of self-worth, not good for anything. But then began to experience quite a bit of success, got some probably positive affirming feedback about how he was performing in taekwondo and other sports, really driving that kind of that sense of worth and value and really tying it to performance, tying it to a kind of success and achievement, and as a part of some of what he was describing. Um, and just that's the salience of that. And no matter how successful, no matter what kind of affirming feedback he was getting, he was still that pudgy fifth grader in his mind. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that can be kind of a gray area too. At what point does this become problematic or just part of what it takes to be successful in this particular sport? When does it begin to kind of creep past that line? Good point. So body image, what is it and how does it relate to eating disorders? Any idea? I mean, if you just to kind of throw out your own kind of definition of body image and what that means to you, what ideas come to mind?
Use the mic when you answer questions. So, thank you.
I guess just for me, it's how I view myself physically, or like my thoughts on how I view myself physically.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, in the research, there's lots of different kind of nuanced definitions, but basically, that's what we're talking about, how we think and how we feel about our bodies, our appearance, and all that goes with that, including behaviors. And so on a fundamental level, this may be oversimplifying it a bit, but basically, when we're talking about body image, this is what we're talking about, how we think, what we feel about our bodies. So why does it matter as it relates to eating disorders? Well, body image becomes a really strongly linked kind of concept to eating disorders. So again, the research pretty much supports research that's been done with both men and women. Body dissatisfaction is really strongly linked to a lot of things: depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, interpersonal problems, as you see highlighted there, disordered eating as well, and body image disorders as well, like body dysmorphia, or kind of a subset of that, muscle dysmorphia. Muscle dysmorphia we'll talk a little bit about later, but that's almost exclusively kind of seen in men, particularly bodybuilders. Also, research supports that body dissatisfaction is a predictor of a wide range of disordered eating and weight-related outcomes. This is just pervasive throughout the literature, that is such a strong component so strongly linked to the development of eating disorders, body dissatisfaction, and all the things that relate to that. That being such an important part of the trajectory towards developing eating disorders or body image disorders. So what do the numbers say about body dissatisfaction? There's been a lot of, if you're kind of looking around to get some information about what research is saying regarding the proportion of men or boys or adolescents that acknowledge struggles with body dissatisfaction at various levels. I was struck by some of the numbers I came across. 60 to 90% of adult males. So when you hear that number, I mean, I'm wondering if you have any reactions to that. 68% to 95% of adult males acknowledge some level of body dissatisfaction. I mean, when you hear those numbers, is that surprising? "95% of college-age men acknowledge being dissatisfied with their bodies, at least to some extent." 95%. I guess I saw that number and I thought, again, at various levels, right? But still, to acknowledge this dissatisfaction, this unhappiness, at least on some level, with my body. Over 90% of men struggle with some level of body dissatisfaction, negative thoughts, feelings, opinions, body image, right? About their physical body. So, and some of what's discussed in terms of what contributes to men struggling with body dissatisfaction, struggling with eating disorders, relates and kind of ties back to, at least to some extent, has been supported by the research, media, and kind of the cultural male ideal, and certainly in Western culture, what that looks like. And what's being found is that with men in particular, it seems as though pumping up and leaning, getting lean and muscular, seem to be the kind of body ideal that's perpetuated in a lot of media, whether it's television or movies, action figures. Interestingly enough, there was research that was done in the 90s, I believe, that was looking at the differences in the musculature of action figures over the decades, and that how muscular action figures are as compared to what they had been in the past. It's gotten increasingly larger, to the point now where action figures, if they were actually, kind of full-scale adult human beings, would actually be bigger than the biggest bodybuilders. And so when you think about just these unrealistic expectations of, body image and what's considered attractive, how many people actually fit that bill? 2% body fat with 20-inch biceps. Now, as it relates to body dissatisfaction, it's not always about just getting, big. For some, it's getting leaner, it's getting, losing weight. And for others, though, there's a sense of kind of, particularly with younger kids, as you saw here, 90% of teenage boys report exercising with the goal of bulking up, getting bigger. Muscles are what make me masculine, what make me kind of successful, what make me attractive. 68% of college-age males believe they have too little muscle. And I thought that was interesting with the 25% of normal weight men view themselves as underweight. Just the perception, just this idea, this belief that I'm puny or I'm small relative to other people, and just kind of a distorted view that a quarter of men have acknowledged, some sense that I'm smaller or that I'm underweight. So some of the disorders that can come about, I'll hit on the three big ones: anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. So for a long time, and we'll talk a little bit about the reasons for this later, but for a long time, it's still the case that eating disorders there's a higher incidence of that in females for sure. But the numbers for men or males has been grossly underestimated for a variety of reasons. But even then, some of the numbers presented here as compared to, when we get to that slide, compared to what some of the numbers were looking like in research articles that were older, suggests that there's definitely, again, an underestimate of the number of males that struggle with these particular eating disorders and body image disorders. And by that, I'm referring to body dysmorphic disorder. So eating disorders in general, basically, again, the definition of that relates to disturbed abnormal eating patterns that result in psychological or physical health problems. For the anorexia nervosa, the major components are significant weight loss. That's a result of restricted eating or restricted energy intake, including starvation, or taking in calories and trying to compensate for that by engaging, in excessive exercise or use of diuretics, or things like that. So those are kind of oftentimes associated with bulimia, but those can be a part of anorexia as well. So again, with anorexia, there's the extremely restricted eating and food intake, in addition to significantly low body weight relative to kind of development, circumstances, things like that. So given your age and your circumstances, we would expect that you would be at about this amount of weight. And if you're falling significantly under that, that would be, again, one of the criteria for anorexia. Also, this distorted view of your weight and shape. So I can be rail thin and still be seeing myself as fat, and in just an intense fear of being fat as a part of that as well. Those are really salient characteristics of the anorexia nervosa disorder. With bulimia, there's the recurrent episodes of binge eating, and in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they have specific criteria that need to be met. I won't go over all the different numbers, but in bulimia, over a 2-week period, I think actually at least 3 times or more, you've engaged in binge eating, which is basically, eating more than what a normal person would eat in that period of time under those circumstances. So I'm thinking Thanksgiving, we're all binge eating over the holidays, but again, under the circumstances. And so are we, is this an abnormal amount of food relative to what kind of normal people or typical, which would be typical of individuals in general, again, under these circumstances. And so it's kind of a gray definition in some ways, and I think diagnostically it can be kind of challenging. But so recurrent episodes of eating large quantities of food, and then as a way to compensate for that, engaging in some kind of behaviors to offset or counteract that huge caloric intake. And there can be a lot of shame that's experienced after binge eating, and then a reinforcing effect of kind of purging or excessive exercise or laxatives or diuretics, getting rid of that can be followed by a sense of relief, which, kind of Psych 101 is very reinforcing. And so we can be binge eating to get rid of some psychological pain or stress, as an example, but then that creates its own shame and stress, and then purging that then can bring some relief. And you can see how that could become a cycle. That could really get out of hand. And binge eating disorder is basically binge eating without all the compensatory behaviors. Typically eating past the point of feeling hungry, to the point of even feeling discomfort, not eating when I'm just hungry, but just eating, and not that in and of itself. Of course, all of us do that, but as a kind of pattern of behavior where I'm not just eating to kind of fill my body up with the fuel it needs to function. I'm eating even when I'm not hungry. I'm eating to the point of discomfort. There's an important component of that is just lack of control, a real sense of a lack of ability to kind of stop engaging in that eating behavior. Embarrassment about the amount of food, being secretive about that, feeling depressed, guilty, disgusted, shame, again, afterwards is a big part of that. And then body dysmorphic disorder. So perceived defects or flaws in appearance that others don't see, or if they do, they're slight. You're concerned about is way out of proportion. My nose is big. Well, it may be bigger, but it's not, like the trunk of an elephant. I mean, it may, to me, look like the trunk of an elephant, but to you, it's a minor thing. And interestingly enough, this particular disorder has been relocated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual into the categories of obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So there's kind of the obsession about these flaws, and then repetitive either behaviors or mental acts that go with that in response to some of the concerns about the appearance or flaws. So mirror checking, excessive grooming, often comparing yourself to other people as examples of that repetitive behavior. Muscle dysmorphia, again, a more specific kind of subset of that, preoccupation with the idea that one's body is too small or inadequately muscular. And so this is something that's seen oftentimes in bodybuilders who can't get big enough to meet some kind of internal standard of big enough. It's always viewed as too small, not muscular enough, not enough. And in the competition, bigger is better, more defined, more ripped. Again, you can see how that could potentially be definitely a risk factor for anybody, along with other risk factors. So somebody can be can experience a variety of different risk factors that can kind of converge, and throw that in with stressful life events or anything else that can kind of begin to trigger that trajectory towards an eating disorder or a body image kind of disorder like this one. So what do the numbers say about eating disorders in men or males? And I want to be clear about that, not just men, but males. So we're including adolescence as part of that. In fact, the onset is often in adolescence and into young adulthood. So 10 million U.S. men will suffer clinically from significant eating disorder at some point in their life. For women, that's a bigger number. But 10 million is a bigger number than what's been kind of reported in articles and research literature in the past. So 25% of individuals struggling with anorexia and bulimia nervosa are men. 36% of those in bed is binge eating disorder. And I thought it was interesting looking at the study of adolescence and the prevalence rate of the DSM. We're in the DSM-5 version at this point. So just eating disorders in general, at the age of 14, 1.2%, 2.6 at 17, and 2.9% of adolescent males report struggles with one of those eating disorders that I just mentioned. Subclinical, meaning, and so subclinical is a term referring to people who are engaging in or exhibiting disordered eating or preoccupation with weight and body shape that's distorted or there's a disturbance in that, are just as common among men as they are among women. Men with eating disorders often suffer from co-occurring problems. This is true of women as well. And so I listed a few there. I listed a few earlier. Depression, anxiety is highly correlated with eating disorders, particularly obsessive compulsive disorder, which again now has its own category. Used to be kind of subsumed under anxiety disorders. And now, again, as I mentioned, has a separate category. That's more of an aside, probably more information than you needed or wanted. Substance abuse, I mentioned earlier. This I thought I did if I didn't. Substance abuse, addiction, Eminem had talked about within the context of his own struggles with addiction, struggling with kind of body image issues, and the running becoming a kind of a compulsive behavior for him. And by compulsive, again, we meaning behavior that's difficult to manage or control. And body dysmorphic disorder, again, much like with subclinical kinds of eating disorders, are affecting as many men as they are women. However, the numbers, although increasing, and we're growing in awareness of, and maybe more men are becoming more males are becoming more open about struggles with eating disorder and body image issues, it's still the case that it's likely, these numbers are likely underestimates of the incidence of eating disorders in males. So the question is why? Why would that likely be the case, you think? That you've read up on this a little bit. So no, I mean, those come to mind pretty quickly, I would say. But stigma, shame, disgrace associated with, and so you think of kind of a Western view of masculinity, what's that view and how that's kind of presented in media, strong, powerful, dominant men, and just in terms of masculinity. There are stigmas attached to this, and so men in general don't are reluctant to seek out health care services, whether that's mental health or physical health. Significant, they definitely less often than women or females are seeking help for medical conditions, psychological conditions. And so you mentioned the stigma related to mental health. So you have this double stigma of maybe struggling with a condition that's oftentimes viewed as something that women or gay men struggle with. And then on top of that, it's a mental health condition. And so there's almost like this double stigma that can go with that. And so, yeah, for sure, that can lead to men being quieter or males being quieter about struggles with eating disorders, body image concerns. Other things that come to mind. Well, let me list a few. So a lot of books, literature is really biased towards women, mostly talking about females. Again, not just women, but adolescents, young girls. Most, if not nearly all, books on eating disorders have a female bias, typically geared towards talking about this struggle with eating disorders as females. Assessments and tests tend to be more biased towards females. A fear of being perceived as weak. Males tend to just seek treatment and counseling less frequently, and again are typically quieter about some of those struggles in general. Also, you think about mental healthcare professionals, if they have their own preconceived ideas about who struggles with eating disorders and who doesn't, how that may impact what kinds of questions they ask as part of an assessment, where they focus their assessment and treatment planning. If there's not some sense that, so if we're not kind of primed to think about, oh, this is something I need to be following up with this particular person, I may not do that. And it was interesting, there was a study conducted that was referenced in an article on foxnews.com. I was really struck by this. British researchers were sharing about what they found in a study that they had done with around 40 participants asking about their experiences with eating disorders. And 10 of them, actually, 10 of the 39 or 40 were men. And when the male participants in the study were sharing about their experiences, one of the reasons they said there was a delay in the recognition, their own recognition of eating disorder symptoms and issues, was this belief that it was primarily a condition that affected women or females. Also, they delayed seeking help because they didn't think that they would be taken seriously. And interestingly enough, a couple of the males in the study indicated that it took multiple times of sharing about their struggles with those issues before it was taken seriously or was addressed. I thought that was interesting. Gender differences in males and females in terms of body image. Men more prone to atypical eating disorders, so these would be eating disorders that may not meet full criteria for some of the disorders I just mentioned, anorexia, bulimia, but there's still struggles with behavior, there's still struggles with body image, there's still engaging in behaviors that are potentially unhealthy as it relates to weight compensation or weight management or eating in general, but don't necessarily meet full criteria. So these would be categorized maybe as a not otherwise specified kind of eating disorder, as an example. Men, as we mentioned before, tend to be quieter about the body negativity, seek treatment less frequently, delay treatment longer. Often, as we talked about, the stigma and the shame being a big part of that. Women tend to internalize those kind of the kind of cultural ideals about what it means to be an attractive woman, internalizing those, body shame more than men, body surveillance, and this is a term I wasn't as acquainted with up until now, but looking at a person's body as a sexual object, focusing more on how it looks rather than how it feels is what's meant by body surveillance, that women typically do that more than men. So there are some researchers that report that men are generally more satisfied with their physical appearance than women and less likely to engage in body-changing kinds of behaviors. However, many other researchers, again, continue to confirm that men struggle with body image issues, particularly as it relates to being too thin or too heavy, trying to meet that kind of male ideal, being lean, being more muscular. Women tend to primarily be concerned with weight. Weight may be a concern for men, but also upper body mass, other parts of the body, weight, illness, health in general are all concerns that males have. Men tend to be more likely than women to underestimate their body size, and that can kind of fit with that body dysmorphia or the muscle dysmorphia. Men less likely to engage in compensatory behaviors like use of laxatives or purging kinds of behaviors like vomiting, but instead excessive exercise would be considered a purging type of behavior, maybe more along the lines of what you might a male might use to kind of counter-effect the effects of eating. So men more likely to binge rather than restrict when they're having kind of negative views or feelings about their body, and men less likely to seek treatment, again, than women, just in general. We've talked about a few of these. I'm trying to be mindful of the time. Risk factors for men, as you kind of go through this list, preoccupation with weight. So if you've been overweight, thinking about weight often, having higher BMIs, people with higher BMIs, people who have a history of dieting, maybe fall into this category of preoccupation with weight. And when we're talking about risk factors, we're talking about factors that predispose somebody, increase the likelihood that somebody who is experiencing these different factors or possesses these different characteristics are more likely to head down the trajectory of eating disorder problems. And so you see more of these things in individuals who are kind of fall into the category of somebody struggling with an eating disorder as compared to the general population, if that makes sense. Personality types, so obsessive compulsive, very rigid, dependent, anxious, perfectionistic. Perfectionism is a big one that's strongly connected to eating disorders and body image issues. Depression, mental health issues can be part of that as well, co-occurring disorders. We mentioned that before. Anxiety is a big one that's a large proportion of people that are struggling with eating disorders struggle with anxiety disorders, sometimes panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, depression as well. Different personality types. We mentioned somebody that's kind of really focused on rules, kind of more obsessive compulsive, kind of focused on rules and rigidly adhering to those rules and rituals and kind of ideas about right and wrong, very kind of dichotomous, black and white thinking is a part of that. There's research that supports that genetics play a role. So identical twins have a higher incidence of kind of shared eating disorder or having eating disorders as compared to maybe fraternal twins or others who aren't as genetically similar. I mentioned perfectionism, behavioral inflexibility, kind of that rigid adherence to rules, rigidity in terms of, you can imagine how that would be impacting coping. To be an effective coper with life stressors, you really need to be able to be flexible, be adaptive, be fluid as the situation requires you to be in terms of being able to cope with that. But rigidity and inflexibility is not going to be helpful with that. Gender, again, more women than men do struggle with eating disorders, body image issues, even though we're becoming more aware that that really is an issue with males as well, and the numbers are growing in terms of incidence of that in males, and again, research and awareness is increasing regarding that. Weight-based teasing and bullying. That definitely can predispose somebody to heading down this path of developing an eating disorder as well. So common signs of an eating disorder. This is just not an exhaustive list, but there's a few. If somebody struggling who's often making self-critical comments about their physical appearance, denies feeling hungry, skipping meals. You may see them excuse themselves maybe from a meal, oftentimes maybe heading to the bathroom, potentially to be engaging in some kind of purging behavior like vomiting or something else. Food rituals, just appearing uncomfortable, eating around others, calluses on the back of hands, so that would be related to vomiting, inducing vomiting, stained teeth, enamel erosion, dramatic weight loss, obviously, and dramatic weight loss followed by or accompanied by comments about still being fat or feeling fat. Certainly could be a part of that. Lies about the amount of food eating. When you watch that video, I think he mentioned that he was either being secretive about it or would say that he ate lunch, but in fact may not have. Excessive exercise, extreme mood swings that can be a part of this, health problems that can result. So this is potentially, it can be a life-threatening condition. Eating disorders like anorexia in particular, they can actually result in death because of the physical problems that result. Heart failure, kidney failure, as examples of that. Evidence of binge eating behaviors. So evidence of that may be, finding large quantities of food gone, wrappers, lots of wrappers and things kind of laying around, maybe examples of that. And again, showing extreme kinds of concerns, preoccupied with, often talking about, thinking about. Behaviors seem to be influenced by concerns related to weight and body shape. So prevention. First, awareness. Men too struggle with this stuff. Adolescent males too. Young boys even struggle with these kinds of things. Learning about eating disorders and the warning signs, similar to the ones I've just presented a second ago. Understanding that athletic activities, other professions, so that's another risk factor. If you're engaged in a profession, like an athletic profession or a profession that requires you to be in front of people, like news anchors, for instance, or you're in the media and there's a lot of kind of exposure, those can increase the likelihood of struggles with, increase the risk of struggles with eating disorders and body image issues. Talking with young men about the ways in which cultural attitudes regarding ideal body image and body shape and masculinity and sexuality, having open discussions about that, talking about the consequences of internalizing some of these messages, just having some critical thinking about some of the messages that are being presented in the media, that we're hearing from peers, that we're hearing from other resources, other sources of information, and thinking about those things, being open about conversations related to those issues, and again, thinking about those in kind of critical ways, challenging some of those ideas, thinking about the consequences of what it means to be kind of acting out those messages or living a life that is consistent with some of those internalized messages that are presented in the media and in different sources. Never emphasizing weight and size as being something that's really important, certainly in terms of your worth and value. Emphasizing more personality, emphasizing things like caring, hardworking, values, internal values, rather than kind of these external, certainly related to physical appearance kinds of concerns. Confronting, this is a challenging one because it's so automatic, I think. The teasing of men who don't, or males who don't fit kind of the traditional expectations of masculinity, that can happen so often that it's almost, I think we can get desensitized to that. But I think with awareness, we can become more sensitized to that. And not just become more sensitized to it and mindful of it, but when you find it happening or see it happening, intervene. beginning to send another message that, hey, this isn't cool. This isn't okay. This is not the kind of thing that we want people to, because this has an impact. Words matter. They can have an impact. And this is not the kind of message that we want people to be receiving, because of it's inaccurate, and it also can potentially lead to some of the struggles we've been talking about today. Again, learning to accept a broad range of body shapes and sizes, discussing again the social pressures to be thin and muscular, really examining those, being critical about those, critically examining those. Examining our own attitudes and beliefs and behaviors related to food and weight, and how what we're doing and how those attitudes inform how we relate to ourselves, relate to other people, what messages we may be conveying either consciously or even inadvertently or unconsciously, and how that's impacting us and the people around us. Engaging in balance, emphasizing health, engaged in balanced eating, eating when you're hungry, as opposed to kind of treating food like a reward. That can kind of set the stage for use of food as a means of control. Modeling healthy attitudes about food, body shape, sexuality, and so on. Thoughts, questions? Mm-hmm.
I haven't really thought about the subclinical aspects.
Mm-hmm.
My experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, and just, with a lack of awareness in terms of the degrees to which it is adversely impacting my life, impacting my health psychologically, physically, how it's impacting my ability to function in different areas of my life. If I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about getting to the gym and making sure that that happens, and other things aren't prioritized that need to be prioritized at times, as an example, then that could be an indication that, this may not meet criteria for some DSM diagnosis, but there's still some level of this impacting my functioning, impairing my ability to kind of carry out the roles in my life effectively. Looks like you're getting ready to say something. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm struck by you being open, and just in our conversation, obviously the topic made this a pretty relevant, made that pretty relevant. But when I was earlier talking about celebrities or being more, I mean, shame is about hiding a lot of times, and so you think about stigma and shame being a big part of why men or males, just in general, avoid seeking treatment for or acknowledging struggles with these different kinds of issues. That the more open men are, or males are in general, about talking about these things, the more aware we become of the fact that these are issues. And I think the shame begins to subside, especially if the response is support. If the response, hey, look, I struggle with this stuff. I'm not saying we have to go share about our own personal struggles all the times with these things, but just creating a safe place, whether that's talking about those issues or other issues. So if I begin to create an opportunity where people can feel safe talking to me, those issues may come up more. And sometimes, part of that can be self-disclosure. Sometimes that's just being willing to ask. Because sometimes we may notice certain things that others may not be aware of in that other study I was referring to. That I wasn't aware. I thought this was a female thing. If you're beginning to notice some concerns, being willing to be open about those concerns, being open and honest about that, and have a difficult conversation that hopefully can begin setting the stage for heightened awareness, maybe if needed, movement in the direction of seeking support or even professional help, if it looks like that may be needed. But being willing to have those conversations, ask those questions, share about your own personal experiences, inquire about that in others, of course, as it seems appropriate in those different settings. But just that this is okay to talk about, I think, again, is an important part of dealing with the stigma that goes with that. I'm not the only one. And there are many people that are highly respected, highly regarded in the music industry, different professions that struggle with it. But they struggle, silently. And, I think the more that we can be willing to be open and have those conversations, and not only have those conversations about those struggles, but the things that may be contributing to those, like how masculinity and the male ideal and what it means to be attractive, or who defines that. Having as part of those conversations, maybe critically examining some of those different sources of information that can be influencing us in those ways. That may be a wordier response than you were hoping for. And I'm mindful of the time. Did you have any other questions? Okay. Thanks for coming.